Thank you. That helps, doesn't it? Oh, I'm getting some feedback now. Can everybody hear that okay? Welcome everybody to this meeting of the Winchester Health and Environment Policy Committee in the Walton Suite at Winchester's Guildhall. Time is 6:30. My name's Jerry Pett. I'm a Winchester City Councillor and chairperson of this meeting. It's being live streamed and recorded to the Council's YouTube channel, and subtitles are available. Advice on how to turn this on is set out on our website. Please could I ask everybody to ensure that mobile phones are at least on silent, if not switched off. In the unlikely event that it's necessary to evacuate the building, the fire alarm will sound. Please follow all the instructions given to you by the team. Can I welcome the members of the public and visiting councillors to the meeting? I would invite you to come forward when it's time to make your contribution, but in fact we have no members of the public who have registered to speak this evening. So that is rather superfluous. Okay, first of all, can I have any declarations of interest around the table? Oh, beg your pardon, apologies for absence first.
Thank you, Chair. Apologies for absence received from Councillor Miller, with Councillor Warwick deputising, and from Councillor Latham. Thank you.
I do apologise for getting ahead of the game. Any declarations of interest that we have around the table? Yes, please, Councillor Warwick.
Thank you, Chairman. Only as I'm also a member of Hampshire County Council, I don't think there's anything of relevance on this agenda, but I'm just making that declaration.
The usual.
Yeah.
Councillor Lee.
A trustee at Winnack, but I don't see anything on the agenda that should cause a conflict or issues. If there is, I'll highlight and leave the room if I need to. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. And I similarly need to make disclosable interest as a member of the South Downs National Park Authority, but similarly, I don't think there's any conflicts there for tonight's agenda. On to item 3, which is Chairperson's announcements. The members of the committee may have seen some email exchanges earlier today about the invitation to tender, future invitation to tender for the contract currently held by ID Verdi for verge management. And I've asked Mrs. Hedden already this evening whether we might have sight of the invitation to tender for that in due course, to which she has agreed. So if members are content, we'll take that as a yes, which will probably be early in the new year. So not in time for parishes to respond to the questions they've had put to them for return by the 8th of December, but we will as a committee be able to look at that in the new year.
Chair, can I just say that the date of December has been given to parishes so we can feed their feedback into the drafting of the tender specification. So that's why it's got quite a tight deadline, and it would be wrong of us to draft the invitation to tender and the tender specification without the parish's input. So that's why, just as a point of clarity, it's that way round.
Yeah, thank you for that. Okay, there being no registered public participation, we move on to item 6, which is the paper HEP 045 on climate adaptation. If I might say that I do beg your pardon, I'm trying to skip through this too quickly. My other announcement I should have made as well was that perhaps last time we were a little self-indulgent on timings, and I think this evening, if we can get through each of these papers, we'll aim to do that in around 45 minutes. Of course, making sure that everybody has had the time and opportunity to make any points they wish to make. But we'll try and keep to a reasonably slick routine if we possibly can. Yes, minutes of the previous meeting, which was on the 18th of September. Which are in your agenda pack. Do we have any comments on those minutes on page 5, page 6, 7, 8, 9, 10:11. No comments at all, in which case are we agreed that those minutes are a true and accurate record of that meeting? Thank you very much indeed. So now we get on to HEP 045 on climate adaptation. Report of Cabinet Member Councillor Lerney, who, thank you very much, Councillor Lerney, you've come this evening to introduce your paper. Over to you.
Thank you very much, Chairman. I will keep it brief so that we can get on to the meat of the item under discussion. The climate emergency is this council's overarching priority, and preventing climate change from happening through carbon reduction has been our main focus over the past 5-6 years. However, the impacts of global warming are becoming increasingly obvious and increasingly severe, and are impacting residents of the district. And it is now appropriate that we not only continue to work on carbon reduction, but that we also consider what we need to do to adapt to a world which is changing around us, and look to the future and how we can protect our residents. We are at the very early stages of this work, and we thought now was the right time to bring where we've got to so far to this committee, so that you can have your input into the work going forward. So this is very much a piece of pre-policy creation work, and I will pass over to Alex Eburn, who has been carrying out the work on this, to give you a presentation around where we've got to so far, and we'll also ask some key questions of this committee where we'd like to hear your thoughts on the matter.
Thank you very much, Councillor Lerney. So this is just a brief set of slides to give a bit of context to the item today. I'm actually going to pass over to our Programme Manager, Sustainability Programme Manager, Catty, who's going to do the brief intro section.
Hi, good evening. We're presenting this based on the assumption that you've read this paper. So as Alex said, this is going to be a very brief presentation on the subject. We're going to talk briefly about introducing climate adaptation. I'm going to hand over to Alex for the climate risk and vulnerability assessment, and then we'll look at the input that we'd like from HEP committee. So as Councillor Lerney has already alluded to, Carbon Neutrality Action Plan addresses areas of climate action where we reduce our greenhouse gas emissions. However, one area we haven't really focused on is how we can prepare for the impacts of climate change. In order to do this, we're carrying out a climate risk and vulnerability assessment, so we can understand the risks that our Winchester district is liable to, as well as the council. I thought it'd be helpful for you to see a climate stripes diagram, which shows how Winchester has changed, the weather patterns have changed in Winchester in the last 100 years. It follows a very similar pattern to Southern England, and you can see that many of the hottest years occur in the last few decades. When we looked at this in a bit more detail, we mapped the number of extreme weather events in the last decade. You can see we've got more storm and gales, as well as heavy rainfall and heat waves or days with high temperatures. Locally, this is having a big impact, and these are just some pictures to bring it home. I'm sure some of you will remember these. We've got 2014 Park Avenue in Winchester flooded, and that was due to groundwater rising. More recently, in August 2020, we had the Winchester High Street flash flooding, and then we also had a wildfire in Hursley in July 2025. What does the future climate change look like? Well, scientists are predicting that we will have warmer, wetter winters and hotter, drier summers. The summers are expected to have increased intensity of summer rainfall events, so very much like we're seeing a little bit at the moment. And sea levels will continue to rise because of the amount of greenhouse gases in the atmosphere already. And although we don't have any, we only have a small bit of coastline in Winchester district, this will have an impact of us indirectly, as a lot of our infrastructure, and we share very close boundaries with communities like Portsmouth and Southampton, and other neighbouring authorities with coastal borders.
So the focus of our paper today is on the CRVA, which is the Climate Risk and Vulnerability Assessment. And as we set out in the report, we're following best practice 5-step methodology for bringing this work together and guiding our wider work around climate adaptation. So that's set out in the report there. It follows the local partnerships climate adaptation toolkit. And that first bit in the red circle is what we're focusing on today, the climate risk and vulnerability assessment element. On the next slide, there are 61 risks that we detailed in the report. You'll find them in Appendix 2. They're across 5 different categories, and the purpose of our assessment is to assess the ways in which the council is directly impacted by those risks and impacts, but also the wider district, so that's residents, communities, businesses and infrastructure beyond our direct control. We follow 5 key steps in bringing this CRVA together. The first one is a risk screening, where we've taken all those 61 risks and we've looked at which ones of those are relevant to the Winchester district in our unique context. And then the next stage on the back of that is, once we've screened those risks, doing a detailed assessment of those shortlisted risks. So on the next slide, please, Catty. So to do that, we put on the slide here just some existing data that we're looking to use and some tools to inform that assessment. And this assessment looks at present day risks, but it also looks at future risks. And those are from a 2-degree global warming scenario, but also a worst case 4-degree global warming scenario. Here's an example of the CRVA risk assessment. So we're doing this for all the key categories and all the risks. This one here is from business and industry, and it's risk to businesses from flooding. As you can see, we've got quantitative scoring of each of those risks, but also behind this, and what will be in the final report, is a big section on narrative explaining how those scores were scored and the methodology and data behind that. So where we are now is we're currently on step 3 of that process. We are compiling a draft CRVA, and we building on that initial risk screening by doing a more detailed assessment of those shortlisted risks. And alongside that, stakeholder discussion and data analysis is a really key part of informing that assessment.
Thank you. So what we'd like to move on to now is we'd like to ask KEP committee to help us inform and shape the climate risk and vulnerability assessment. We've set out 4 questions which we would like to cover in the discussion with the remaining time. The first one, which is, which climate risks do you believe will have the greatest impact on the Winchester district? If we can spend a bit of time discussing this and then move on to the next one, if that's suitable.
Okay.
Thank you, Chairman. I've got a couple of questions on the preceding paper, actually. If you could look at page 16, I'm just going back there myself. So I'm.
Are you asking a question on the way we're going to do this, or on the paper
Well,
itself?
there are certain matters in the paper that I think need exploring. I think assumptions have been made that are not
Go on then.
necessarily good enough. On page 16, you've excluded the marine risk. As has been pointed out, we do have a small section of coastline, but perhaps a bigger risk on this is that our neighbouring authorities have quite a high exposure from rising sea levels. Some of the previously redundant military sites have been earmarked for housing, and some of those are very exposed to rising sea levels. And I've got some concern that we shouldn't perhaps be excluding the marine environment from our list. And that small stretch of coastline, there are farms, I believe, on that stretch, which is in agricultural use. On page, in section 2.19, on the bodies to be consulted, we haven't got the NFU on that list. So farmers are impacted by climate change. We have clay caps in the district that have become unfarmable because of the changes in weather, the more extreme weather events. And I think we should probably add them to the list if we could do that. The Hampshire Farmers Union is keen to engage, as in the local, as is the local country CLA, the Country Landowners Association. Chairman.
Okay, thank you for that. That certainly strays into one area that I was going to bring up, which is that you've got 2 farm clusters on there, I think, as being engaged, but they don't cover the smaller family farms, particularly in the river valleys, that are perhaps at greater risk because of their position in the valleys, with increased flooding risk. They stand to lose probably proportionally quite a lot more. So whether it be the NFU or another body through which you engage them, I think, as Councillor Power says, they need to be engaged in the round. But I think moving forward, shall we, if we're content as a group to go through on that basis?
Chairman,
I
there's
beg
a
pardon,
couple of errors on that table, so do you want to pick up those before you go into? a
Okay,
sort of
let's
debate?
do that then, yes, please.
So
Yeah.
it's the paragraph 2.19 on page
Yeah.
20. Hampshire's down twice, which is fine, but you've got Southern Water, but you also probably need to include Portsmouth Water as for the southern part of the district there, and you may want to include the Environment Agency, the Regional Flood Committee, because this is exactly the sort of work they pick up on and fund as well. So that would be the Southern Regional Flood Committee that would cover this particular district. Thank you.
Okay, the Southern Regional Flood Committee, is that a committee of the EA or?
Yeah, they sit under the EA with various other bodies sitting on them, but they are the main funders for flood relief and match funding. So county have a couple of reps on those flood committees. There are 3, I think, that affect the county Hampshire area, but the southern would include the Winchester district specifically.
Okay, it makes sense. Yeah. The other water companies within our area, yes, certainly Portsmouth Water would need to be there for covering their groundwater sources. Okay, any other points on the? Yeah,
thank
Councillor Lee on
you.
the
I just wanted, again, key external stakeholders. Countryside Land Association is quite a big organisation, which no doubt would be quite keen to understand what the strategy is all about. And then just going back, I'm not sure you picked out business, industry, health, communities, infrastructure, natural environment, and assets. One of the issues is what I call atmospheric chemistry, or air. Well, obviously it's air quality. We've got an air quality strategy, but there are some particular nuances about that which I'd like to bring out. And I just wondered why that doesn't stand out as a top level risk category in itself. Thank you.
Anybody want to answer that one?
Yeah, no, thanks. Lots to go through there. So I'll pick on the first one, a bit about some of the extra stakeholders to consult. So that was obviously part of the reason for bringing it to you guys today, to have a bit more idea about those stakeholders. So we've noted those NFU, we've noticed also smaller farming and then river valleys. We've also noted Portsmouth Water and the EA Southern Regional Flood Committee. So we'll look now to engage with some of those bodies. The other question we got as well was around exposure to rising sea levels and some of that coastal risk that we initially scoped out. We did have a bit of deliberation around that particular risk and whether it was warranted being included in our further risk assessment. The key part of that risk screening is really a materiality assessment. It's assessing how much of a risk is it going to have. And for that one, from our various different scoping discussions, we had scoped out based on that premise of it having limited impact. But it's something we haven't concluded the whole stage yet. If that's something that members really think needs to be included, we can look at assessing that. The other question as well was around air quality from Councillor Lee. Just to note, in HO7 there is a risk which is called risk to health and wellbeing from changes in air quality. So any air quality related factors would be considered under that. And if as part of this you have any suggestions or points to raise on those 4 points related to air quality, then we'd certainly welcome that.
Okay, thank you. Right. Any more points on the general approach? Councillor Power.
Just one, Chairman. I think if, as is suggested, the marine risk, the sea level risk is to be excluded, I think we should say it has been considered and the reason it has been excluded to show that we've covered it off. Thank you.
I mean, just for clarity, this is the small part of our district that's in the tidal portion of the Hamble, correct? Yeah. Okay, if there's nothing else on the general approach, let's go through these four questions then that we've been asked. the climate risks that will have greatest impact on the district. Open house, who wants to have a go on that? Councillor Lee.
Yeah, I labelled it as emergency planning. The increased frequency of climate-related incidents requiring response and recovery capacity. I know it's a catch-all, but I think that should be somehow really up there, front and centre, given all the aspects that create the impacts.
I think there's an interesting, there's something of an overlap here between this and the next paper, actually, isn't there? That are we talking about our resilience in how the communities deal with incidents that result from climate incidents and other things, or are we looking at the specific risks, climate risks that will have impact? I think that's verging towards the next paper, isn't it? I would think. Any particular thing on risks themselves, Councillor Power?
Chairman, I have my Old Testament moments. So it's going to be fire, flood, pestilence, plague, and a murrain of cattle. And if you look at it, we've had all five. It's a question of what we can mitigate and what we should mitigate, and how we're going to focus our attention. Is it going to be on people? Is it going to be on the preservation of businesses? And I'm not quite clear, because there is a risk to all sectors of our communities on those fronts, those five fronts. What can we mitigate against and what can't we mitigate against? I don't think it's our job to mitigate plague and pestilence. I don't think that's on our remit, except, as you say, in the next paper. But what have we got in mind? I mean, you can't just throw the special maintenance team at everything, talented as they are. And I'm trying to.
I see your difficulty, but I think the exam question we're being asked is which climate risks do we believe will have the greatest impact on the district? Risks as opposed to effects that they may deliver upon us. Yeah. So,
if I may, just to help guide us through, this is a step process, as Alex set out, and we're just at the early stage of actually identifying the risks. And then the further stages will be, okay, which of those risks will have the greatest impact, which ones can we mitigate, which ones should we, which are in responsibilities of others. So at the moment, we're just at that first stage of identifying like the risks and the hazards, and then we will do further work on the appropriate response and planning and who is responsible for those different responses. So I absolutely take your point, but the response will be shaped by what we determine to be the most important risks in the first stage here.
thank you. Councillor Brophy.
Less a question, more I suppose an observation. Maybe what we could do is take a I suppose a utilitarian approach to this, which is like either the greatest good for the greatest number of people and the greatest harms to the greatest number of people. So you could take the example of a field on fire in Hursley, which we've had recently in my ward, and Councillor Warwick's ward as well. The impact of that might be far less than, say, a large urban area getting flooded and having lots of people potentially needing to be rehomed at a very short notice. The impacts that we might be best, it might be better for us to direct our energy towards how we could affect, help the most people at once. So if something like flooding could impact a lot of people, do we have kind of good alternative housing arrangements for them, for example? Or, I'd say that's probably a useful thing. Similarly, if you have heat waves, for example, does every community hall, for example, have air conditioning, for example, act as, say, again, this is overlapping with the next paper about community resilience. That could be what they call it, like cool banks or something like that, isn't it? So having a kind of a strategy in place like that could affect more people, or that could minimise the impacts on more people, might be the guiding principle.
Councillor Warwick.
Yeah, I think Councillor Brophy's right. Flooding is the one that seems to come around time and time again. So living in Hursley, you know, we know every 4 or 5 years the groundwater levels will be really high and will flood, and there's always a similar sort of panic, you know, of what do we do, what equipment is there, how do we let people know. There was a really good piece of work done, Susan, I don't know if you can remember, after the 2014 flooding. I think there was a sort of almost an inquiry chaired, and there must be a huge wealth of information and learning from that piece of work that won't really have changed very much. But we had the sort of whole goal command, I think, where the whole Winchester came to a halt, and you know, and us councillors said, oh, well, what can we do to help? And the officer said, just stay away, which is great. But you know, it was about, I think comms was the big thing rather than the physical doing, because there were people that were able and capable and trained to do that, and for us it was more about information to parishes and residents and where they could get help, and when the sandbags would be collected after they were used, all of that sort of stuff, which is, it's quite mundane but it's really important. So that piece of work must be still in existence, and I suspect nothing much has changed in that sort of flooding tends to be quite cyclical. So that might be worth sort of finding. I can't remember who chaired it now. I want to say it was Dave, or it was sort of one of the officers anyway. That would be really good. Thank you.
Absolutely.
Yeah, I think in a sense it's in the paper, isn't it? I mean, I've got 6: flooding, extreme heat and heat waves, heavy rainfall, storm intensity, water scarcity, drought, wildfire risk, ecosystem habitat degradation, and the other one I've just added is what I would call prolonged poor air quality, which has a human impact and also potentially an impact on habitat and wider. So those are the ones I've come up with. Obviously, stronger sunlight on South Downs slopes, faster atmospheric chemistry, and the consequences of that are really quite dire, and those intensities will increase. And I've seen HO2 on page 25, but I don't think it comes out for me. And I think that's something that we may want to consider as a big climate risk. Thank you.
I must confess, I was looking at that and thinking, actually, if we're talking about which will have the greatest impact, it's all those related to health and people. So you're absolutely right. And I would suggest that increased or prolonged increased temperature, the effect on the elderly, on the more vulnerable, the effect that flooding has on the more vulnerable as well. You know, if you don't protect your people, you know, infrastructure and everything else, and business is largely secondary to that, I would have thought. That's a worry.
Just really quickly with drought, I know temperature's related, but drought is not on there, and that obviously had an impact this summer.
Yeah, it's interesting actually that you're quite right that within the H category on there, drought isn't mentioned at all, is it?
Just I suppose an observation on stakeholders, and I suppose how we consult with people. I think part of the role that maybe we could start to do is or play is to change some of the conversations we have. So if our agriculture gets impacted by higher temperatures or drier conditions, you might need farming to look very different. We may need more polytunnels, for example. We may need more vertical industrialized farming in a very different way. And how would that conversation look with some of the consultees like, you know, South Downs National Park, for example, or Natural England, that might have a very different definition of what a natural landscape looks like, which might not be a climate resilient conversation. And at that point, we'll have an intersection between our planning decisions and some of those kind of traditional perceptions of the countryside. So I think with a 4-degree temperature rise, that conversation will be unavoidable, really. And I think, you know, maybe it's for us to kind of anticipate those discussions and lead that conversation a little bit more and change, you know, facilitate that kind of mindset change.
That's the better.
Thank you, Chair. Yeah, I'm just thinking about it, and you know, flooding is, I think, probably one of the most visible impacts, and the one that our our residents see, you know, whether it's just, you know, that bit of road that always floods when it rains to, yeah, torrential downpour and flooding in Winchester town centre. It's very visible, but just because that's the biggest impact today or currently doesn't mean it's going to be the biggest impact in 2 or 5 years' time, when actually it might be heat waves or wildfires. And if those wildfires happen near built up areas, the impacts are going to be much greater. So I think it's and again, you know, flooding might flood a village or Winchester town centre, which has a very big impact on people's livelihoods and their homes. But the number of people impacted might be relatively small, might be a couple of hundred. Whereas if we have something like high winds, which is regularly bringing down tree branches across roads, railway lines, etc., although the individual incident might not be as severe, they might be more frequent, and the number of people impacted are much greater. You know, that would run into, you know, if the roads closed, there could be tens of thousands of people impacted. So I think it's quite, you know, I think my view is that we need to look at all of the risks, and not just the risks today, but the potential risk for what if, you know, heat waves become more frequent or wildfires become more frequent. What if, you know, flooding happens in areas that then impacts the water supply, you know, contaminates the water supply. Yeah. So my view is that we can't just say, well, you know, this and this are going to have the greatest impact, so we're going to focus on those. I think we really need to do a comprehensive risk matrix across all of them, and not just looking at today, but trying to look into the future and say, well, you know, what happens if flooding incidents increase, or what happens if, you know, number of heat waves increases? What's the future impacts then?
I'm glad you brought the word matrix in there, because I was just about to say it's down on here as a two-dimensional problem. I think it's more a sort of three-dimensional piece, isn't it? It's not just the individual risks, but it's how those risks affect particular groups of people, you know, the old vulnerable and all the rest of it. So I think, I mean, clearly you've got this set of 61 risks is drawn from other national government sources, isn't it? I'm sort of slightly amazed that at that higher national level there isn't that more three-dimensional approach to it. But you're telling me that there isn't, presumably.
No, we do note in the report that, as well as looking at that more general assessment of council services and the wider district, what is the risk? So the increased severity, increased frequency of those climate incidents and the impacts associated with that. We also are, as part of our strategy, looking at vulnerabilities. So what we've got, the benefit of having local areas, we can do a deep dive into local areas to understand how vulnerability changes across the district alongside that more general score. That's something we're looking to do. So we're making use of things like geospatial data that can help us to unpick for risks like flooding. Where might some of those more flood prone or areas at risk be, some of those neighbourhoods? So that's one of the key areas of work we're trying to do to lay out probably that third lens of the matrix, as you said, as well as that general score of risk. We're also looking at where are some of those areas that are at greatest vulnerability and greatest risk. And that's something that at a national level, compiling a risk assessment of that scale and that number of risks is quite a large undertaking. At a local level, we have the benefit of being able to dive a bit deeper into those risks.
I think even at the local level, it's a pretty significant piece of work, isn't it? If I can put it like that. Councillor Lee.
I'm looking at figure 3, having listened to what Councillor Bennett said and so on. The question I'm asking myself is, you know, where is the resilience to withstand shock and then recover? I mean, the risk surely is, the highest risk is where you can't do that, where your chance of recovery to the shock is limited or zero. And it's very hard, isn't it? Because there's going to be a whole host of things, businesses or whatever it might be. And without some granularity, it's quite hard to identify prescriptively what is the highest risk. I don't know if that makes sense, but for me, it's the resilience to withstand shock and recover. If we can't, that's the highest risk. perhaps.
Councillor Brophy.
Just looking at question 2 here on council services that will be impacted from just a practical level, and referring to Councillor Warwick's point. I remember the floods in 2014 when I was in Kingsworthy, and we had exactly that kind of absence of information or looking around for who knows, and and so communications within the council is a function that we have. We do have kind of established social media channels and a website and things like that. So maybe, one of the roles that we would be expected to have is to cascade information out or signpost people to other agencies. So actually anticipating that demand in advance and making sure there's a readiness for that built into our comm strategy would be quite useful. It probably is, in fairness, doing our comm team.
Okay, so I think in that run round we've answered more or less each of these 4 questions. Which climate risks do you believe have the greatest impact on the Winchester district? I think you've heard a fair sort of cross-section of views on that, but how we think those risks are also very much interrelated. Which council services do we believe will be most impacted by climate change? Well, again, it's pretty cross-cutting, isn't it? And if we say protection of our people is the most fundamental element of our duties as an authority, if you like, then each of those risks that are in that paper affect all of our services to all of our people, more or less, don't they? Now, how we actually articulate that in the paper, not quite sure. 2 seconds and I'll come to you, Councillor Lee. Similarly, which residents, communities and businesses are most vulnerable to climate hazards? We've mentioned farming. We've mentioned vulnerable people, vulnerable communities. And we've run through other key external stakeholders we think you should incorporate in there. Councillor Lee, you had another point.
Yeah, and on the question, we moved on to question 2 now, have we?
Yeah, we seem to have sort of covered more or less all 4 of those.
Sure. So, I mean, in question 2, council services most impacted by climate change. I mentioned it earlier. I think that's emergency planning, and then within that, you've got housing services, place services, public protection, asset management protection, natural environment services, economy, and community. And that's a catch-all. But emergency planning, for me, is going to be most impacted. We're going to have to ramp up what we do to deal with incidents which are going to be deeper, wider, harder to recover and deal with.
And I think that goes back to the point we made earlier of the Venn diagram of this and the following paper, isn't it? It's the resilience of our communities and our businesses and our infrastructure in dealing with these risks. That's the key issue, isn't it? Rather than the risks themselves. Or other, we've got that in the second paper. Councillor Power.
Thank you, Chairman. I think I'm one of the few councillors around this table that was a councillor when the lockdown was declared in the pandemic. And I would refer you to the action which was taken across the district in those cases, because I think there are parallels, and Mr. Lincoln is with us and he is an expert on the subject. But what we saw was that small communities set up a support network very quickly. In the towns, it took a bit longer because you needed 2 levels of response structure. In the city, it needed council officers to make it happen. And I think if you can look at how we responded to that across the district, not just as a council, there are lessons to be learned. The local resilience forum, I'm afraid, run by Hampshire County Council, was a chocolate teapot. Because they got out in 10 days an emergency food package, most of which was inadequate and inedible, I'm afraid. We've been through this before. We've been through these emergency situations before. Let's learn from what we did then and then apply those lessons to what we plan to do in the case of these events, which will happen more often.
Thank you. Councillor Lee.
I just want to endorse what Councillor Powell said. During COVID, I sat at Citizens Advice National, I was able to look across all the local authorities. You're absolutely right. Those who had their resilience plans in place were adept and fleet of foot to be able to support their communities because they'd worked it out and they considered all those aspects which were dire. Yeah.
I have to come back on that. None of my parish councils had an emergency plan, but they got one set up, PDQ. And it was without the intervention of Winchester City Council. We just made it happen.
I could almost sit here smugly and say my parish did have one, but the trouble is it was for flooding and snow and not for COVID. But I think you're absolutely right that many of our communities, particularly the rural communities, the smaller communities, were really adept at getting that sort of level of resilience sorted amongst themselves. So it's perhaps a two-tier thing, isn't it? Bottom up in the rural areas or the market towns as well, perhaps, and top down more in the city. Yeah. Any other comments? I think we've sort of merged questions and debate on this, but I think the ask from us was sufficiently vague to allow us to do that. Councillor Brophy.
Just elephant in the room is LGR and the fact that the us won't exist anymore. But obviously it could be something to embed within things like a new town council, for example, and how, given what we've just said about the effect of parishes, the impact of local communities, how we can kind of create those kind of tiers underneath the unitary, and how we could kind of create the foundations for that to hand over.
Councillor Whitty.
Yeah, I've just got one more thought. In that, actually, the impact of weather incidents that actually aren't we don't really see in the UK. So one thing specifically is snow. So the last time we had significant snowfall, I think, was probably about 15 years ago. Yeah, it must have been. And one of the biggest impacts for me personally, because I work in the travel sector, was the closure of Heathrow Airport for 3 or 4 days. And the reason they had to close it is they hadn't invested in snowplows to plough the runways and the taxiways because it hadn't snowed significantly for so many years. And I suspect that's probably a story right across the country, not just in Winchester or Hampshire, that actually if we did have significant snowfall event, we do not have the ability to respond to it adequately and to keep infrastructure open. And although it might not happen, I suspect when it does happen, it will be a significant event. Just the nature of climate change, it's just very volatile, and that could potentially impact every single resident across the entire district and cut them off from access to food supply, water, if pipes freeze, etc. So although it's probably one of the smallest risks, if it were to happen, it could have one of the biggest impacts. And I think it's important to consider those sort of, once in a generation events and how they might impact the district as well.
Thank you. I think we probably cover that and risk of low temperature and snow for a protracted period. I think asking us to sort out Heathrow is probably a bit much, but I get the point entirely. Yeah. Okay. Do you have enough from us to go to the next level on this?
Yeah, that's been a really helpful discussion. So I just want to thank everyone for your input and feedback into those key questions. I think particularly at number 4, some of those external stakeholders for us to engage with. It's right time really coming to head committee today because we're just about to engage externally on this. So start to have those discussions with key external stakeholders. So we'll make sure to reach out to some of those groups that you've identified. And also just want to echo that point that was made earlier about we recognise the large scope of this assessment, 61 risks at a local level. It's quite a large undertaking, but the purpose of this CRVA really is to identify where those key risks are and where we should channel our work when it comes to the action planning stage. Where would we have the best bang for our buck and where we should take most action to reduce our risk? And we see it in light of LGR as an opportunity as well for us to articulate what are the key risks and needs for the Winchester district and then seize opportunities for responding to that at a larger scale when LGR happens. So yeah, just thanks again for all your feedback and input. And this will be something we'll be working over the next couple of months in concluding.
Go on, one last one.
One last one. are we alone in doing this? Are all the other local authorities across Hampshire doing this in the same way, in the same timescale?
Hi, thank you. So other local authorities in Hampshire are leading on this, not all of them. For example, New Forest, Southampton, Basingstoke-on-Deane and Test Valley have, but I don't know if they're following the same model. This is the model we're doing is set by the Local Partnerships Toolkit. It's likely they are because it's based on the government's climate change risk assessment, the most recent one.
Right, and the very last one from an Old Testament prophet, Councillor
Thank
Power.
One last recommendation, Chairman. I think all councillors and staff should do water safety training. Mersey Fire and Rescue do a very good 20-minute presentation on the risks. And I found it educational when I did it. Perhaps we could put that on the list for training.
Sorry, training in
Water safety.
water safety.
How not to drown
Okay.
in
Thank
4
you.
inches of water on a good day.
Right. In that case, I think that's everything on that paper. Councillor Lurley, do you have enough as well?
Yes, thank you.
Good.
Yes, I've looked it up and I found the flooding paper, so I've passed that on to officers. Turns out both you and I were on that group.
Okay, thank you very much
Thank you
indeed
very much.
to the officers and Councillor Lurley. I will bear a pause of a minute or so while people move about, and then we'll carry on.
Thank you. Can I shut the door now, Chairman?
Yes, please.
Chilly.
At least there was no Christmas music wafting in. It's been unbearable. Right. Let's move on then to HEP 044, which is the Community Resilience Strategy. Councillor Bah. It's the ghost of Christmas past. Thank you. Councillor Becker, do you want to introduce your paper?
Absolutely. Thank you for having us tonight. Despite many years of supporting communities across the district, this council's never actually had a strategy to provide clear direction about what sort of support we should be providing and how that should work. So this new draft strategy is intended to fill that gap. It's been informed by various other council documents, by local, regional, national policy and legislation. It sets out our approach for creating stronger, more resilient communities across the district to 2030, working alongside our diverse communities. This includes drawing on the strengths and assets that already exist in communities throughout the Winchester district and new communities. The strategy sets out 5 pathways and a series of associated principles by which to build social capital and create stronger, more resilient communities. It's still draft. The team is re-engaging with local community groups who have fed into the creation of this document. I ran into the team downstairs. They were just coming from one of these events. They're doing another tomorrow and another next week. So we've brought it to you tonight for your input as well. There are 3 questions in particular, similar to the last paper, that we'd like your views on. Does the strategy reflect the issues that impact on the resilience of the communities you represent? Are the proposed pathways and principles comprehensive, and do they address the issues? And what measures could we use to monitor and demonstrate the success of the strategy? Just have to point out, having listened to the previous paper, this isn't an emergency resilience plan. We do have a separate emergency response plan, but it is related, as Councillor Power has said. And we saw during COVID that some communities, I have to say in the city, there were some areas that responded incredibly well and demonstrated they were a resilient community, but there are other areas that struggled. So this is about building up communities so they can all be in the position to be able to respond when something happens. But it's not just about that, it's about the well-being of the community as a whole.
Okay, thank you. I think that was a key issue I was going to ask, actually, what exactly the scope is. And I think you've covered that quite neatly there in relating it back to what Councillor Power was mentioning earlier on. It's how we make communities sufficiently resilient that they can come up with their own responses to shocks.
It's exactly that. It's about empowering. It's taking our role as a council that empowers our communities to be able to do things for themselves, while also taking a facilitative approach when that's necessary, so we can respond appropriately to communities. There are lots of communities out there that frankly don't really need the council support in the same way that other areas do. So it's recognising that we need to provide the targeted support for those that really need it, and we've used lots of data in order to prepare this draft strategy to identify where those communities are. But there are other communities that frankly let them get on with it and they do a great job.
So just to bottom this one out for our following discussion, just talking with people in the last few days, we've talked about things like how would we cope with a cyber attack on the Tesco's logistics chain or something like that, where the shelves empty and whittle quite quickly. That's not what you're asking us about.
That's not what. That's more the emergency response plan.
Yeah.
It's a different
So
thing.
how do we cultivate our communities, if that's the right word, to have the sort of infrastructure that allows them to respond in the way we were just talking about the villages and the market towns?
That's an aspect of it. Yes, it's not the entire focus
No,
of this.
but
the
it's
entire
more that
It's
sort of thing.
that
isn't it?
sort
Yeah.
of thing.
Yeah.
Mr. Lincoln also has some words of introduction
Yeah,
too.
Mr. Lincoln, over to you.
Yeah, thank you, Chair. Councillor Becker's covered a good deal of what I was going to say. I think I just wanted to really stress some things which members will be aware of, but I think just helpful in the context of the strategy. We're obviously a really large and really varied district, but some very different communities across our district. Not all just defined by geography. So I think one of the things that we can all slip quite easily into is making this all about a sort of geographical focus, and that is a big part of this. But it's also about communities that might come together due to sort of similar ethnic backgrounds, or communities of age, communities of interest, people with common interests, common things that bring them together, church communities, all sorts of things that bring together. So communities can take all different sorts of shapes and forms, and I think this strategy is intended to really look across the piece and consider how we support all of those different communities, all of which play a really important role in supporting people. So some people will come together as part of a geographic community, but at the same time they'll come together as a church community and in other ways. So this kind of covers that really broad piece. Some of our communities are really strong, vocal and independent, but others less so. And some of this is about trying to balance that out and fill in some of the gaps and sort of help make sure there's a sort of equity across the district in terms of the capacity of our communities to cope for themselves. We've already mentioned how recent years have tested communities. So COVID and the cost of living crisis and these sorts of things have really tested communities, but also given them a platform to really demonstrate their value, show what they can do, and in some cases show what they can do actually better than we can. So this absolutely isn't about us doing unto them or showing them the way in every case. Sometimes we can help, and a lot of our facilitation is around that, but in some cases communities are far better placed than we are to support the people that live there. So this is around creating an environment in which they can thrive and in which they can do that, and COVID was a perfect example. There's no way we could have got out to all of those communities and understood what they needed, how they responded and reacted best. That knowledge was already out in communities, and it's just about helping support them to do that job really well and therefore play their part along with us. The first part of the strategy discusses some factors that impact on personal resilience, things like housing, transport, open space, which are really there to set the context for the work that follows. We're really not here, and this strategy is not about sort of developing our thinking around providing housing and addressing housing issues or such like, but they're really important things that the council does that provide some context for how communities function and how the individuals within them function. So that they just kind of set the basis. It's sections 5 and 6 of the report in Appendix 1 are the ones where we're really focused, because that's about how we support our communities, how we work with them, how we help them fill the gaps and build their capacity to do their thing. Public sector services are stretched, we all know that, and communities can help play a part, and you know, some of the things people turn to us to, actually the communities can do equally well and better. Local government reorganisation has been mentioned. That means we've got an uncertain future. Resilience and capacity of our communities is going to be more important than ever. So I think everything else has been said. We've set out the 5 pathways in the report and in the strategy and in the covering report, and we're just really keen to hear what you think of those, whether you think they address the challenges, whether this resonates with you in terms of the communities that you represent. Yeah, and that will then enable us to take this work further forward. Thank you.
Just to add to all of that, the document that you see in front of you this evening is not the public facing one. This is obviously, you know, all the theory that sits behind it. The final version will be an accessible document that our communities can engage with and access. At the moment, it's probably a little bit unwieldy for some of our communities, but it's the theory that sits behind it. But that will be translated into an accessible document that our communities can use.
Thank you. Before opening it out, I would just note an interesting sort of inversion here, that we were just saying that the rural communities, the market towns, were better at using their community infrastructure to cope with things like COVID and all the rest of it. I would just observe that the enablers to that resilience in the rural communities, the market towns, are things like the provision of primary care services, the provision of, funnily enough, churches as well, because there are fewer and fewer members of the clergy actually out there. So it's not infrequent that you hear there's one rector in charge of 8 or 10 churches. So that side of the community is not as robust as it was. And other enablers such as public transport in the rural communities. It's the opposite set of problems to the city itself. Councillor Lee, you were.
Thanks, Chair. I want to thank the Strategic Director for putting my mind at rest. I thought this is a rather wordy document and hoped this wasn't going to be the public-facing final product. But I wanted to go to the purpose of the strategy at 2.22 and just endorse what was said, really, which was obviously we've got ability to create resilient places, i.e. new, and then there's a case of adapting what exists. And, you know, I was much struck by the place, you know, we want the new communities planning to shape the place we live in and how we live in that place. And then you grow, evolve and solve, which I think is some of your catchwords, which I thought were spot on, and the capacity to do that. But I wanted to highlight, and I'll share this with you, in another life in East Hampshire, I was involved in a potential development at Northbrook Park, where they, as part of the local plan in section 106, were about to establish a village charter, which would then have allowed that new development to become self-sustaining, become a permanent, caring, responsible community to enjoy a sustainable way of life. And I just thought when I dug it out, and I will send it and share with everyone, it reminded me how brilliant it was. And if we could do this everywhere, then I think, you know, we're winning. You know, it's a fantastic blueprint that signposts communities on how to help themselves. The other point I wanted to make was I was looking at the Empowering Healthy Places LGA report, which I thought was quite good. And it's got in there at the back a 15-point checklist for promoting neighbourhood health and well-being. And I thought, actually, I hope that's something that will be in the final product, and easy to read and easy to refer to, particularly for a parish who wants to pick up on the things you talked about, Chair, community hub, adopting those churches as warm places to do all the activities that communities like to do. So thank you.
Councillor Power.
Thank you, Chairman. I have a question and it relates to safeguarding. How do we balance the celebration of local resources, local communities, and yet meet the needs to protect people because they may be at their most vulnerable time when they need that network? Thank you.
It's an interesting question and not an easy one to answer. I think our role here is around working with and supporting communities. So one of the things that we would do, and which we do with a number of organisations, is to encourage them to be aware of the sort of issues they need to address. So just as an example of how we then apply that in the work we do when we're offering grant funding to organisations, we would always test their understanding of safeguarding issues, the extent to which that might be documented, whether they've got adopted policies, that kind of thing. So we can't take responsibility for all of the things that happen out there, particularly with this kind of approach that we're setting out here, which is the only one that we can really adopt, which is of empowering and encouraging communities to take action for themselves. But we can help try and raise awareness, educate and support them to understand what steps they should be putting in place. A really good example of when this came about was, again, the COVID time. It'll probably be used as a point of reference a number of times, and we had lengthy conversations in sort of us and colleagues across the county at the initial stage where we were dealing with the crisis of the situation, and we were balancing the comparable risks of people kind of going out there and just supporting and helping in a fairly unregulated environment against not sending those people out because we're requiring them to be checked and double checked and signed off and all that stuff. And at the time, and admittedly, that was a unique set of circumstances, so we wouldn't necessarily follow this approach all the time. At that time, in that initial response stage, the view was that the greater risk was not going out and helping people. So I think our role is in making sure people are aware, and there's lots of resources out there. There's other organisations who are specific, who are probably more bespoke in providing some of this support, but we signpost, we direct, we encourage them to understand what they should be doing. So hopefully that answers the question.
That's perfect.
Just trying to think how to frame this question. I guess one of the things that struck me when I was looking at this report were that there's lots of different variables involved in what we perceive to be a resilient community. So, but often those, I think we've already pointed out, some of them are intention, for example. Jerry, your comments just now. You may have rural communities that have, as the report indicates, high economic activity. And they'll also have, for example, but they'll have poor transport, but they might have a church, for example, and a strong parish. So you have different things that we've all identified as being important. They might have the worst possible broadband and digital infrastructure. Yet in this report, we're almost having all of those things there as if they might be indicators of a healthy community. A lot of these things are correlated, but they're not necessarily, we don't necessarily know what the causal relationships are between that and what we perceive to be resilience. And I suppose my concern is there might be a certain amount of a lot of jelly thrown at a wall to try and work out what sticks. I'll give you a very, very silly and facetious sounding example, which is that you could have correlated the happiness of communities with the access to a pub. Actually, that's not such a silly example. I think research has shown that some of the happiest communities will have a pub to go to within a walking distance. And so things like that, a pub is a kind of, sounds a bit facetious and a bit flippant, but it could be that, are they walkable from somewhere they can go? If you look at young people in Winchester during the summer, they all go and sit in the cathedral grounds, and that's effectively their community. And yet it's very hard to capture that, and that kind of thing isn't necessarily here, that kind of geographical aspect of things, or the kind of the assets that create those things. So I suppose that's a long-winded way of saying is how have you identified where those causal relationships are, and it's perfectly fine if that's an ongoing work in progress.
It's a really good question. And I don't think personally, I don't think the pub thing is a facetious thing. I have to say there's a time in my life when my community, probably my number one community, was based around a pub. And actually, you know, there's an awful lot around that. And we do work around, for example, assets of community value. And those generally are pubs because they play a really, really important role in life and community life in a number of communities, particularly smaller ones, more rural ones. So I think there's actually quite a lot to be said for that. And in a way, it brings out, I think, the fact that we've identified a whole series of kind of factors or issues in the strategy, not necessarily saying that, if you like, every community should have one of these or should have this. You're right that every community is different. In some communities, the church will be a really important part. Other places don't even have a church. And I think what this strategy is trying to bring out is that, to a degree, communities themselves should lead that. They know what's important in their community. They know who the important people are. They know what the important places are. We're not trying to tell them they should have a church or they should have a pub. What we're trying to do is support them so that, if you like, the key components, they're very different buildings, very different facilities, but if you like, at the base level, they're serving the same purpose, which is a place for people to come together, congregate, be with like-minded people, and get support and networks, that kind of thing. So I think we're very much around, this is an enabling piece of work, and it's about supporting communities to help to support themselves. So being led by them rather than being led by us, I guess.
So yeah,
And thank you. If I just may add to that as well, you'll recall that we did quite a lot of work on health priorities, where we looked at the social determinants of health and well-being, and they are those very similar factors that have been considered in this report as a database, drawing on the joint needs assessment, the joint strategic needs assessment, which does have geographical mapping and does do some of that correlation. And I suppose it touches a little bit on what we were talking about earlier, which is identifying those risks. So if you have multiple incidences, it's more likely, you know. So I think we have been looking at mapping community facilities. So you're right, it is going to be this layer, and hopefully with all of that information, we can identify those areas that might need more targeted and focused approach. But yeah, there's lots of pieces that will fit together. Yeah.
So if I may, would you therefore be able to find hotspots of deprivation where, say, there's no playing fields, or there's no places to go to, or there's no community halls? Would that be an output of this kind of work?
We do have some of that information already, as I say, through the health priorities, which is around access to those sorts of facilities. And we mapped it, and if you recall, the public health officer from Hampshire County Council came and spoke about that they've done profiles for a number of wards. So we do have that information, but I think this is more the people focused side of then how do we engage with those communities? How do those communities engage and you know, come together to address that? Because some of that infrastructure we won't be able to address their longer term. So
just building on what Councillor Brophy was saying, one of the things I put down when reading through this was I hesitate to use sort of consultancy speech, but it would be nice to see some desired outcomes. Well, I think that's difficult in this case, but what perhaps would be better is what, again, an awful phrase, but what does good look like? You know, are there examples, as Councillor Brophy was just saying, of places out there that do have the sort of full set of facilities, community attributes, or whatever that we can recognise as a strong, resilient community? And by contrast, are there those that don't? I realise that's much easier to say than it is to write down. But any thoughts?
I think my thoughts would probably be that all communities have, it's a bit obvious, but all communities have strengths and most will have weaknesses, and some will probably appear to have more of a rounded package, but all will have, there are some communities I know, and I won't name them, you know, which would be lacking in some of these things, you know, whether it be kind of community voice or whether it be sort of facilities, but they will have some other strengths as well. I mean, if I had to say one community, a good sign for me in terms of the work that I do, and I've been here for some time now, is the communities where me and the team have to spend the least amount of time. That generally means that communities are pretty self-sustaining. They have a good handle on things. They're not coming to us in need of too much support and assistance. I mean, I have to say, one community that is very independent, very proactive, Bishop's Waltham. And you know, one of the things that Bishop's Waltham has is a very active and proactive parish council. I think one of the things that comes out in here, I'm not saying Bishop's Waltham has a better parish council than others, but I think one of the things in the strategy which we play on in the Recovery Report quite strongly is the role of parish councils. I think it's a really important one. They're real champions of their local area. They're real activators of community activity. So I think one of the bits of work that I think is a really important one for us is that ongoing work with parish councils in light of local government reorganisation and all of these things as well, and to foster that relationship and support them to do the best job they can as well. So going back to the original question, hard to say there is a community that is the standout one, but there are some things that you see in kind of communities that stand out and which we'd like to encourage others to have. So and part of our work as well, I think one of the pathways is around connected and better informed. One of the things I think we have the ability to do is be that facilitator of sharing good knowledge and good practice, and we try and do that, and I think there's more we can do in that front as well in terms of just getting people to work together and learn from each other.
Okay, Councillor Brewer, if you want to come back to something, then Councillor Lee, and then Councillor Power.
I think you almost answered the tension. I think there's a tension here because you say that the best thing should be that these initiatives should be community led, but the areas that most have the greatest needs might not have the infrastructure or the communities or the parish and the representation to be able to make their voices heard. So it's almost a tension, but then you also pointed out that the areas of greatest needs you notice because they have the greatest demand. So they almost, it strikes me that there's almost got to be a kind of a push and a pull effect whereby you can actually identify based on the data of needs that are coming inbound to you where we need to build that resilience, and other areas where the resilience where we need to keep on and empower them. I suppose my example of young people in the cathedral grounds is a good one because often people sort of say, we don't have like, you know, bowling alleys or ice rinks or anything that young people need, and they don't necessarily participate in these kind of processes to make their voices heard. So the question is how you can create, you know, places and spaces for people who don't participate and, you know, don't amplify their needs.
Absolutely, and again, voice is one of those things that comes out as one of those strong pathways, and one of the areas, you know, we're obviously doing a piece of work at the moment around the town, Winchester town area, around governance and the lack of a parish town council at the moment. So that's we're sort of working to identify views on whether that is a gap that should be filled. But you know, a community which we often deal with, and Sue mentioned around the sort of the JSNA and the data, you know, Stanmore, the St Luke area of Winchester is one of the areas. It often flags up on the data in terms of disadvantage in a number of ways. It's one of the areas, and again, I'll come back to COVID, but you know, where we really struggled in terms of having an easy route into the community. Where's that community's voice? Where is the channel to then get to that community and for information and resources and support to easily be cascaded out? Parish councils are often the way. It's not always the way. Sometimes it's the churches and other organisations, but in communities such as Stanmore, that was more of a challenge for us. Thankfully, other things organically came out of the woodwork as a result of COVID, and some of those are still around now and have really helped improve the situation. But yeah, we do have a sense of where some of these things are. But then there are other ways in which Stanmore as a community outdoes others. So you know that they will always have their strengths and weaknesses, but in different areas, and you know, voice representation is one of those where sort of we can see a need to support more, and we're doing what we can to try and help fill that gap, facilitating conversation between agencies and organisations, working in areas like that. So yeah.
Councillor Lee.
I just wonder whether there's a way to approach this to provide some sort of tailored blueprint. Maybe I'm thinking about the new opportunities tied to the local plan. So you mentioned Bishop's Walk, that's a market town. Clearly, a small rural settlement is a different ballgame altogether. And then you've got the bigger settlements and so on. So I was going back to my checklist, and again, I wondered whether there's something that could be shaped to make it more useful for those different entities. And then I go back to the village charter I mentioned, where it talks about key services, village pub, shop, hall, technology work hub, green, retail units. And there's another breakdown there, and that's probably tied to what I've just said for the existing as well as for the new, and just trying to help, get the right outcomes.
Just in response to that, you're absolutely right, and I can't say that up to this point we've kind of had a prescriptive checklist, or we've worked to a prescriptive checklist like the one you described. But one of the things which we do mention in the strategy, I think probably under the sort of broad heading of sense of place and belonging, is we talk a little bit in there around new emerging communities, and that's a perfect example. When we're starting with, in some cases, a green field, we are building a community from scratch. And all of those things are things that we do, and we in the planning agreements through the local plan and the associated planning agreements, we secure resources for, or we secure delivery of community infrastructure. Where we can, we secure resources to put community workers on the ground for during the period of the development to try and form some of these softer networks. And in a lot of cases, and those examples where we've done it, the governance thing around establishing sort of parish council and new governance to represent that new emerging community. So you're absolutely right. Those new communities and the local plan, that is a way, and it's a place where we really need to do this work, because all of that sense of identity and belonging that our existing communities have built up over all those years just don't exist, and it's, in a way, that's one of the key things that pulls people together and gives them the motivation to support each other and work with each other. So there's a really big job with those new communities, but it's why we do invest quite a lot of effort in doing that.
Councillor Powell, then Councillor Westwood.
Thank you. Thank you, Chairman. There is no anonymity in a village, and there's not much in a market town, as we know. These two papers go very well together, Steve. Now we have a letter to parishes, and we have the city council newsletter going out, I think, most weeks. We can see that there are going to be more life-threatening events coming over the next few years, while we're still councillors, while we're still here. So could we celebrate when there's an example where a community just goes ping and puts a resource in place to meet a need? Could we celebrate that in the one of the parish newsletters? Yeah.
That's an easy one to answer. Yeah, we absolutely can do that. I think we try and do that. Obviously, there's only so much kind of bandwidth to celebrate everything that's going. There's such a lot of great stuff that goes on out there, but we really do try and do that, because I think, there's a lot of stuff we can't take any credit for, but there's a bit that we can as well, because we do some of that. And as a whole council, we do a lot of that facilitating and enabling, and the role of you all as local members is really important in that as well, in terms of, you're out there doing that stuff in your communities as well, and sharing that knowledge and passing the information back and forth. So I'll definitely take that back as a sort of a desire to do that and share more. Absolutely. Thank you.
Councillor Westwood.
Thank you. I'm having a bit of difficulty with your use of community groups and understanding what you mean. You seem to be talking about physical location a lot of times, an area of city, a village, a market town. I take your point, Councillor Power, about there's no anonymity in a village or a market town. There's absolute anonymity in this city. And community groups don't have physical boundaries around here. So I live in the full flood area. There's no such thing as full flood. No one recognises that as it, but they know they live there, don't they? But is there a community there? No. And communities are quite different things to different people. So there'll be a community around any school. All school mums will know each other, and the dads that go up there as well. But equally, I remember from my kids growing up, there was a community around the school, but I wasn't in that community because I was working in London all the time. So I wasn't part of that community. But what I was part of was part of the Saturday morning dad's football community, which was very different again. In full flood, we used to have a bus, and there was a community on the number 4 bus, believe it or not. that community was older people who were kind of isolated in their homes. So they're in the middle of a city, 25,000 people, and they're lonely. And the bus was a non-lonely place for them. So I read through this paper, and I think you're missing a dimension in this paper through it. It is not a physical community in many, many cases, and certainly when you get into the city. There are no parish councils in this city. So we don't have that as you would have it in a market town or in a village as well. So I'm struggling with the whole concept here as to how we actually take this forward in the city example that I'm trying to give, because you don't have these nice neat boxes in which to place it. So, Councillor Becker.
In some areas of the city, we do have it. So, as you know, I represent Hyde, Winnell, Hyde, Abbots Barton. Those are the three main communities that form my ward. And I would say that each of those do have their own individual communities. More so in Hyde, I would say they do have the economic advantage over the other two areas, but they do very much have, they've got groups like Wilder Hyde, they have Hyde 900, the Friends of Hyde Abbey Garden, they've got the church. So they do have these geographical boundaries that we do see in other areas despite living in the city. But I do take the point that there are other communities that then form, you know, if you send your children to a school that's not the closest to your home, you're part of a community that suddenly isn't geographically linked to where you live, but geographically linked to where your child attends school. Those are more difficult to identify. We have tried. We have. The event today was based in focused on talking to community groups in the city, but that is an area I think we can look at a bit more as we develop this strategy further.
And I think it's exactly the sort of feedback that we need from tonight, because I mean, I think I mentioned in my introduction that the intention of the strategy is that it isn't just around geography. So clearly we've not got that quite right. And if in my answers I'm focusing on geography, then I'm not getting it quite right as well. And I said we fall into that trap, and I'm falling into the trap again. So the intention of the strategy is it absolutely would pick up those different dimensions of community and what community means to different people. So we'll take that away and absolutely look at that, because we do need to make sure that comes out more strongly if it's not there already.
Can I come back? I think there's community development to do in the areas that I've talked about. So in the area where I live in Cheriton Road, there is a Cheriton Road WhatsApp group, but equally there's a full flood WhatsApp group which is like 3 times the size and overlaps it, and there's a Fordington Avenue little group there. There's the community group in the pub that I use in the middle of full flood there. There are a lot of groups, but I would say that, and we had this conversation a couple of days ago, that I probably don't know the names of my neighbours 4 doors away. Whereas if I lived in a village, I might do that because I might see them at the local shop. I come into the city centre, it's inundated with visitors, which is a great thing. I'm not complaining. But I don't bump into my neighbours in the same way that you might bump into your neighbours around your area. So I think there's a lot more thought needs to be put into the city, and I accept there are groups in the city and there's areas in the city that do have an identity, but I think there's an awful lot that don't, and I think there's a lot of lonely people sitting in those areas that we need to go and find, and I think there's community group development to be done in the city, and the parish council approach may well help us to do that in certain places, but I think there's far more to do.
Councillor Brophy.
Just building on the comments of Councillor Westwood, I guess one of the observations I had about this document that jumped out was that it takes pains to define resilience, but doesn't define community. And I think that is one of the paradoxes that we're talking about here, that community is rooted in place, but sometimes it is rooted in time of life events, whether you've had a baby or whether you've had a stroke and you go to a aphasia support group, for example. You see things like that, and so there's kind of transient communities that happen based on activities, and then there's activity-based communities, there's needs-based communities, and then there's also geographical-based communities. it almost strikes me that it's like defining obscenity, you know, the famous phrase of I don't know how to define it, but I know it when I see it. And I think we're almost dealing with something here where we all know what a good community feels like when we're there, but it's quite hard to put your finger on what it is, which is partly why, you know, I've made the point about so many different variables all at work, and they don't necessarily all contribute to a good community. A good community might have, say, 2 out of 5 of the things we've defined, but be very successful. And, you know, so maybe the approach of looking at, as Councillor West would say, the areas that are really lacking in some of those things might actually be more important, where the actual black holes are, where no one's coming forward and where there's no parish or no infrastructure at all to help support. So it contradicts with the whole, again, community-led approach. But yeah, so maybe my feedback there would be a little bit more kind of effort to define what we're trying to build, even if that's not an easily defined thing.
Any more?
Just a small thing. I think it's a really good paper actually, and I just so Hampshire's we've just redone our strategy. So you might just want to, and it was only passed last Thursday, so you won't have referred to it in this document, but it might be worth a look. And we actually cut short. We haven't gone beyond LGR, so our new strategy goes 25 to 28 because it's hard to define what comes next after that, which is probably a bit of a cop out. But you know, I think the principles are going to be similar, aren't they? So just to flag that, but I think it's important for us to define why we're here, who we're trying to help. It's almost impossible to define a neighbourhood, you know, because it'll mean different things to different people. But you know, I think it's a great document. It's thorough. It's considering everything. So thank you.
Okay, I think, and I've written a couple of things down here, but I think we've all highlighted the fact that it is really difficult to define communities, isn't it? And communities could be anything from a bunch of people on a bus that only runs 1 day a week, which I saw in Osselbury a week or two back, you know, same people meeting because it's filling a vacuum and it doesn't cost them anything. And it's a rather wonderful thing to see. But it wouldn't be obvious to include in here. But I think what is easier to do is some form of sort of community hierarchy, geographically based community hierarchy of needs, if you will, which might include pubs, it might include schools, it might include a whole raft of things, and different things in different places. But something that puts a little more definition on both communities themselves and the needs that they have to enable them to be more resilient, I think is what we've sort of bottomed out between us. Does that give you what you hoped to get from this evening?
You've given lots of feedback. Thank you. Yeah, that's really helpful. And so we will take that away. We're also engaging with a number of our community stakeholders almost as we speak, not quite, but so we're taking that information we get back from them as well to sort of refine what we've done and bring that work forward. Yeah, thank you.
I'd like to say thank you. It's a really good piece of work. I think the only thing I would say is perhaps a little more definition up front of what it's trying to achieve, so that we don't all run off into different directions as we might have done when first reading it. But other than that, really good. Thank you. Okay. Do we have anything else on that paper? No. On the agenda, then moving on, we come to the forward programme, I think. Scroll through. Here we go. Right, so agenda item 8, the Health Environment Policy Committee work programme for the rest of 25-26. Charles, do you want to take us through this?
Yes, of course, Chair. So in February, we are planning to bring a paper forward that will cover the public spaces protection order. So officers are currently looking at developing a public spaces protection order to cover the city centre and some other parts of the district. What we thought is, because this is new policy, it would be good to bring it to this committee to get a steer on that. We are also planning to bring enhanced a green financing paper that will look at biodiversity, net gain, and also carbon neutrality and so forth. And then the last paper, so we'll have 4 papers at the February meeting, will be around building a resilient waste service, and that will particularly focus on a piece of work that we're doing with residents, in essence, to be more resilient around recycling, around food waste, and how we interact with those, as well as businesses, given the change in the waste sector. So that's going to be around a behavioural piece of work, but I think it'd be really good to have members in early feedback into that, around what that looks like, because that's going to be a 6-month campaign that we'll do across the district.
Thank you. And on top of that, we've got a more training session on the 19th of Jan for.
So there's a training session on the 19th of January for all members to attend if they wish, on green financing and the mechanics around that, what that looks like, and that's an action that's come out of scrutiny committee.
Thank you. And then taking on the 2 task and finish groups that we set up last time out, I think both of those have met now, and both are in the sort of very much in the definition space of what they're taking forward. And I think there will come a point, probably for each of them, at some stage in the new year, where we'll need to look to officer support to sort of round off those bits of work. And I think I said last time out, what we're probably looking at is a sort of straw man paper for each of them, on how we might take certain ideas forward. Certainly the private sewerage system group is engaged with other authorities now in helping them come up with ideas that we might want to look at putting to a wider audience next year. And I think the EV charging point 1 is in the same sort of space. Okay, yes.
Chair, if I may, I know we have discussed, but officers will need to be involved in that, given that we are service planning for the year ahead. And whilst we appreciate the work that you're doing on the task and finish groups, it does need to feed into the wider service planning work so we can facilitate accordingly.
Yeah, of course, we wouldn't dream of doing anything else. Anything else on the forward programme? Right, in which case, that brings us to the end of the agenda. Thank you very much indeed for your participation. Time is just past 8 o'clock, so we've more or less stuck to our schedule. So thank you very much for that as well. And thank you for all the officers who've supported us this evening.